By April 1945, the end of the war was finally in sight, but the nation was shaken by the sudden death of Franklin D. Roosevelt. Into this moment of uncertainty stepped a man who had long remained in the background. 60-year-old Harry S. Truman took the presidential oath, becoming the 33rd President of the United States. As the 79th Congress applauded him, millions of Americans quietly wondered how such an ordinary-seeming man could lead the nation through such an extraordinary time. Among those watching Truman were his friends, rivals, and political opponents. Now that he was president, he was entitled to their loyalty. He asked for their support and issued a warning to America's enemies, calling on all citizens to remain united in defense of the ideals Roosevelt had so powerfully expressed. He reminded the nation that even the most skilled pilot could not safely guide a ship into harbor without the full cooperation of the crew. Every individual, he said, must do their duty so that there would be no misunderstanding. Truman made it clear that both Germany and Japan could be absolutely certain that America would continue fighting for freedom until all resistance was destroyed. For an entire generation, the word president had meant Franklin D. Roosevelt. Those who grew up during his 4 terms remembered his bell-like voice, commanding presence, and decisive leadership during times of crisis. His influence had left a deep mark at home and abroad. Anyone who followed Roosevelt was bound to appear inadequate by comparison. He had been seen as a firm yet caring father figure to the American people. Winston Churchill is said to have remarked at the time that the day of the eagle had ended and the day of the sparrow had begun. Like many observers, Churchill could not yet imagine Truman's potential for growth. Truman, a plain-spoken man from Missouri with traditional values and strong biblical beliefs, suddenly found himself at the center of a boiling mass of international crises. Nazi Germany had just surrendered. The great powers, Joseph Stalin and Winston Churchill, were preparing to meet the President of the United States, whom they regarded as an unequal newcomer. Berlin in 1945 stood as a grim monument to Europe's devastation. From the ruins of the city, a massive issue would soon rise in Truman's future. Potsdam, Germany, once a cultural center, had become the setting for confrontation among the Allied powers. Joseph Stalin, leader of the Eastern world, was driven by a single overriding goal: to achieve the greatest expansion his people had ever known. Winston Churchill, an aging statesman locked in a struggle with Stalin, greeted Truman while preoccupied with his own political fate, as he was soon to be replaced as Britain's prime minister. The conference quickly bogged down amid protests over communist influence in Poland and Germany. The deadlock was suddenly overshadowed by a message Truman received from Washington. An extraordinary new scientific weapon had been successfully tested. When Stalin was informed, he appeared unimpressed and simply told Truman that he hoped the weapon would be used. Truman wanted no guidance from Stalin. What he wanted was Soviet entry into the war against Japan. Any assistance from Russia could save American lives, and that concern dominated his thinking. From the Potsdam Conference came a final ultimatum to Japan: unconditional surrender or total destruction. Millions of leaflets were dropped across Japan. To many who found them, they were little more than curiosities. Although American bombing raids had already taken place, the Japanese people had been raised on a belief in their nation's invincibility. The warnings from the West were often collected as souvenirs and largely ignored. Aboard the USS Augusta in the calm Atlantic, Truman waited for Japan's response. If the answer was negative, there would be only one option. Protecting the lives of American soldiers was his highest responsibility. A scientific instrument capable of saving those lives would have to be used if necessary. Even under immense pressure, Truman's modest and straightforward manner puzzled some Americans but reassured many others. He appeared steady in moments of crisis. If Roosevelt had been like a father to the nation, Truman seemed more like an uncle, approachable, yet firmly in command as president and commander-in-chief. When Japan rejected the ultimatum, Truman reviewed the situation with Secretary Burns and Admiral Leahy. His decision was final, and there would be no turning back. The press was not informed. Only the man who made the decision fully understood its weight. Soon afterward, an American aircraft dropped a single bomb on Hiroshima, rendering the city useless to the enemy. It was an atomic bomb, the release of the fundamental power of the universe. Hiroshima and Nagasaki became the only 2 cities ever struck by such weapons. At that moment, no more atomic bombs existed. On August 14, 1945, reporters crowded into the president's office, anxiously awaiting news from Japan. Truman announced that he had received a message from the Japanese government, replying to the communication sent by the Secretary of State on August 11. He declared that Japan had fully accepted the Potsdam Declaration, agreeing to unconditional surrender without qualification. In the celebration that followed victory, few Americans paid much attention to a small peninsula in Asia. In August 1945, in Korea, American forces participated in the formal surrender of Japan alongside unfamiliar new allies. Soviet troops had only just entered the war against Japan and now shared in the responsibilities of victory. To manage control, a dividing line was established, separating the region into two zones. That line would later become a defining moment in Harry Truman's life. Throughout history, many Americans have celebrated the end of wars, but in the 20th century only two presidents were confronted with the immense task of restoring peace on a national scale. The transition required balancing housing, employment, wages, and prices while encouraging investment and industrial growth within a free enterprise system. President Truman argued strongly for price controls, insisting that the nation had the power to make the post-war era one of unmatched opportunity and prosperity. However, he warned that if greed, impatience, partisanship, and short-sighted thinking were allowed to dominate, this historic opportunity would be lost. Senator Robert Taft emerged as Truman's chief opponent. He accused the president of pushing the country backward, advocating a return to wartime controls such as the Office of Price Administration, the War Labor Board, and the War Production Board. Taft framed the moment as a decisive choice between a free America and a centrally planned economy, calling it the final stand against planners who believed they could manage the people's affairs better than the people themselves. The Republican-controlled 80th Congress followed Taft's direction and moved aggressively to eliminate government price regulations, ultimately succeeding. Although Senator Arthur Vandenberg took a more moderate stance than Taft, together they sustained strong opposition to Truman's domestic agenda. In 1946, escalating labor unrest culminated in a nationwide railroad strike that halted all passenger and freight movement for 2 days. Truman responded decisively, requesting emergency powers from Congress. He sought temporary authority to resolve the crisis and permanent legislation to establish a long-term labor policy aimed at preventing future disruptions. Most controversially, he asked Congress to authorize the drafting of striking workers into the armed forces. Soon afterward, the railroad strike ended under terms proposed by the president. The resolution satisfied few. Labor leaders accused Truman of betraying them and labeled him a strikebreaker. Business leaders criticized him for meddling in private enterprise, while some members of Congress charged that he was expanding presidential power toward a quasi-dictatorship. Truman remained unmoved. He believed that avoiding criticism required inaction, and he refused to be passive. He accepted risk, believing that leadership demanded boldness. Just as ships were not built to remain safely in harbor, neither were nations meant to stand still. One of Truman's boldest actions came in foreign policy, when he decided to confront Soviet expansion in Europe. Under Joseph Stalin, the Soviet Union had absorbed Yugoslavia, Hungary, Romania, and North Korea, with Greece and Turkey next in line. Truman proposed substantial economic aid to both nations. Despite resistance in Congress, the plan passed. The Truman Doctrine preserved Greece and Turkey and marked America's decisive entry into a new global leadership role. Alongside his newly appointed Secretary of State, George C. Marshall, Truman expanded this strategy with an even more ambitious foreign aid initiative. Their goal was to prevent communism from overtaking the remaining free nations of Europe. Marshall, a highly respected former Army Chief of Staff, was chosen to lead the effort publicly and guide the proposal through a skeptical Congress. His authority carried weight, and he reminded Americans that the nation now bore immense global responsibility, serving its own interests by serving the broader good of the world. In 1947, Congress approved the European Recovery Program, widely known as the Marshall Plan. It became a landmark bipartisan achievement of the Truman administration. Truman described it as one of the greatest acts of constructive statesmanship ever undertaken, a cooperative effort aimed at the common good and America's response to the challenges confronting the free world. While immediate aid addressed Europe's urgent hunger and shortages, the Marshall Plan's true purpose was long-term economic reconstruction among non-communist nations. West Germany was central to this effort. After 2 years of Allied occupation, Germany remained divided, and West Berlin emerged as a powerful symbol of American responsibility. With Marshall Plan funding, German industry revived and flourished. This success alarmed communist leaders. In the spring of 1948, Cold War tensions escalated when East Germany imposed a blockade on West Berlin. What began as rumor quickly became reality. The American response came from the skies. The Berlin airlift, later remembered as a miracle of modern aviation, sustained a city of 2.5 million people entirely by air. For a full year, Allied aircraft delivered supplies around the clock, landing every few minutes. Global opinion eventually forced the Eastern Bloc to retreat. The blockade was lifted, and supplies once again flowed into West Berlin by land. The crisis ended in a stunning technical achievement and a powerful demonstration of free world resolve. The people of West Berlin responded with open celebration. As commander-in-chief, the airlift decision belonged solely to Truman. At home, he now turned to another defining issue: civil rights. Seeking to move the nation forward, he publicly declared his belief that America had reached a historic turning point in its struggle for freedom and equality. Recent events, both domestic and international, had shown that protecting civil rights was more urgent than ever. Truman insisted there was no moral justification for discrimination based on ancestry, religion, race, or color. The reaction at the 1948 Democratic Convention was swift and severe. Southern delegates responded with hostility, and 35 Dixiecrats walked out in protest against the administration's civil rights platform. At the outset, only local party insiders believed that Harry Truman had any real chance of winning the election. Nevertheless, the Democratic Convention ultimately rallied behind the sitting president. With Alban Barkley as his running mate, Truman secured the nomination through a late surge of support. On the Republican side, the party united completely behind Thomas E. Dewey, who confidently promised that beginning January 20th, Washington would witness the largest cleanup operation in the nation's history. The presidential race of 1948 was highly unusual. Dewey was favored by odds of 20-1, and he reassured his followers that his safest strategy was simply to avoid mistakes. Campaigning in Missouri, Truman's home state, Dewey openly criticized the president, even doing so beside a Democratic mule. He attacked Truman's record, pointing to what he called a reckless budget, defending the Taft-Hartley Act, and highlighting the deep divisions within the Democratic Party. These divisions were real, as the Democrats faced opposition not only from the Dixiecrats but also from Henry Wallace, the Progressive Party candidate, who held strong support in New York. Dewey also campaigned across the South, following traditional political customs. Meanwhile, Truman launched his now famous whistle-stop campaign, emphasizing personal connections and small-town charm. He introduced his family to crowds, greeted children, entertained adults, and made sure no stop was overlooked. Parades down Main Street alongside World War I veterans were intended to energize servicemen voters, and Truman himself relished returning to the daily routines he had long missed. Truman often described politics as the art of governing, but persuasion was clearly its central skill. As the campaign grew tougher and the odds against him worsened, Truman intensified his attacks. He warned voters about rising inflation and the increasing cost of living, arguing that price controls were a proven and practical solution. He placed the blame squarely on the Republican-controlled Congress. He accused the 80th Congress of betraying ordinary Americans, claiming it had harmed farmers, favored big business, and weakened labor unions through the Taft-Hartley Act. Truman's confrontational style energized crowds. He understood that voters admired toughness and determination, and that applause followed strong attacks. Even so, he knew no candidate could win everyone over. By late October, Dewey remained far ahead in the polls, despite growing media reports that Truman's aggressive, grassroots campaigning was gaining traction. Most observers believed the whistle-stop tour was more spectacle than substance, resembling a traveling carnival. Still, Truman himself remained convinced he could win. The final verdict would come on election night. As the polls closed, uncertainty lingered for hours. Radio commentators reported confusion, and many journalists, confident in a Dewey victory, went to sleep after arranging wake-up calls. At dawn, the nation awoke to a stunning surprise. That morning, Dewey conceded defeat with dignity, sending Truman a telegram offering congratulations and urging Americans to unite behind the new administration in the interest of peace and national strength. For Truman, the victory was pure joy, like celebrating Christmas early. He bore no resentment toward those who had doubted him and reminded Democrats that he had succeeded despite widespread skepticism. He recalled predicting his victory months earlier, even as newspapers and commentators overwhelmingly insisted someone else would win. Delighted by the outcome, Truman joked about uniting Democrats of every kind, those who supported him early, late, and even at the last moment. At a later dinner, he humorously reenacted election night radio broadcasts that had wrongly predicted his defeat and suggested the election might be decided by Congress. Believing those reports, Truman went back to sleep. Later that morning, a telegram informed him that the race was over and that he had won. Once again, the man from Missouri had defied expectations, becoming a remarkable political figure and one of the most memorable upset winners in American history. Even members of his own family watched in amazement as Harry Truman seemed to accomplish it on his own, earning immense public admiration. His personality, once dismissed, suddenly came into sharp focus. Reporters who had previously claimed he lacked character now wrote about little else. Everything Truman did attracted new public attention. Media coverage of his trips back home to independence took on a warm, sentimental tone, almost like organized vacation tours. Even his tropical shirts and stylish hats became newsworthy. Political cartoonists abandoned their sharp, critical sketches in favor of friendly caricatures. Truman had suddenly become everyone's president. Editors praised him as a magnetic figure, a master political escape artist. Americans have always admired the unbreakable courage of a man who refuses to accept defeat and ultimately triumphs. Yet the re-elected president soon found himself confronting historic events once again, along with the necessity for bold decisions. By 1949, nationalist China had collapsed under its own failures, and the nation became communist. Criticism of Truman grew loud and relentless, as though the President of the United States could control every global force. Truman, however, demonstrated remarkable resilience. He was not overwhelmed by bad news. He possessed the rare ability to focus on his responsibilities without letting them consume him. As he believed, the world belonged not to the timid, but to the energetic. To safeguard the achievements of the Marshall Plan, Truman chose to rely on military strength. For the first time since the Constitution was signed, the United States entered a military alliance during peacetime. This alliance was NATO. Under Truman's leadership, 11 North Atlantic nations joined America to form a unified military force dedicated to mutual security. To lead this new alliance, Truman selected a man whose military prestige and personal integrity represented this bold new direction in foreign policy. That man was Dwight D. Eisenhower. As he departed, Eisenhower expressed his deep hope that his mission would bring peace, security, and tranquility to the nations of the Western Atlantic. Truman assured him of full support from the American people and from the 11 allied nations of the Atlantic Treaty. With warm farewells and wishes of good luck, Eisenhower took command. Truman's choice proved flawless. Eisenhower brought both commanding authority and an unmatched military reputation to this historic initiative. With Ike in charge, NATO members felt confident and secure. Only the Kremlin viewed the appointment with displeasure. For the first time, free Europe had a means to resist communist expansion, which now appeared to be nearing its limit. Eisenhower sacrificed personal political ambition for this role. Truman had previously offered him the Democratic presidential nomination in 1948, but Eisenhower declined, preferring military service over politics. Now, he would unite the armed forces of 12 nations under a single command. The communist response to NATO was calculated and determined. After NATO's success and the United Nations' refusal to recognize Communist China, a new crisis emerged. On June 24, 1950, North Korean Communist forces stormed south across the 38th parallel in a violent attempt to seize the entire Korean peninsula. Truman and Secretary of State Dean Acheson viewed the invasion as a threat to all smaller nations and a direct challenge to the authority of the United Nations. At Truman's urging, the UN Security Council passed a resolution calling for aid to South Korea. The Soviet Union, having boycotted the Council over the China issue, was absent. Following the resolution, Truman ordered U.S. military leaders to send troops and supplies. American forces, operating from General MacArthur's Pacific bases, soon landed in Korea and were immediately engaged in combat. To servicemen and their families back home, Korea looked, sounded, and felt like war. Truman referred to it as a police action, a term that drew little criticism until reports of casualties began to emerge. Less than 5 years after VJ Day, Americans were once again fighting overseas. Truman addressed the nation, acknowledging the heavy burden such decisions placed on American families. He explained that these were the gravest choices a president could make. While Americans hated war, they cherished their freedoms and would not allow them to be destroyed. For families with loved ones in Korea, abstract principles offered little comfort. However, early success lifted spirits. General Douglas MacArthur executed a daring and brilliant amphibious landing at Incheon, striking behind enemy lines. The maneuver cut off North Korean forces and led to the liberation of South Korea. Truman praised MacArthur, calling him the right man for a critical mission and a truly great soldier. MacArthur soon sought permission to cross into North Korea and defeat the enemy on its own territory. Truman and the United Nations approved, but with strict conditions. MacArthur was ordered to avoid direct conflict with Chinese or Soviet forces. The goal was to reunify Korea, eliminate the dividing line, and conduct free elections under UN supervision, without triggering a Third World War. MacArthur publicly criticized these limitations. The two men met at Wake Island to address their differences. Truman stressed the importance of not provoking Communist China. MacArthur claimed he did not believe China would intervene, but insisted he could defeat them if they did. After the meeting, formal courtesies were exchanged. American aircraft soon struck military targets near the Chinese border, while evidence mounted that Chinese support was flowing into North Korea. Soviet-built MiG fighters, operating from Manchurian bases, engaged American pilots, using the border as cover to strike quickly and retreat to safety. As winter slowed ground operations, MacArthur complained that air power was being restrained by presidential orders. In November, he prepared a major offensive and confidently predicted the war would end by Christmas. Meanwhile, deep inside Communist China, massive forces of trained volunteers were preparing for a decisive mission to drive American and UN troops out of Korea. On November 26, an overwhelming human wave of nearly 200,000 Chinese Communist troops poured across the Manchurian border and struck General MacArthur's forces. Despite determined resistance, American troops, who had come close to victory several times during the Seesaw campaign, were forced to retreat. The sight of Americans pulling back sparked a new wave of criticism against President Truman. Bogged down in the Korean conflict, Truman's prestige fell sharply that spring. MacArthur soon reorganized and revitalized his troops, launching yet another offensive against the Communists. By then, Americans had been fighting in Korea for almost a year. Both Truman and MacArthur desperately wanted a decisive victory that would resolve the Korean crisis. U.S. forces drove the Communist armies back into North Korea and reclaimed the 38th parallel. At that point, MacArthur began openly discussing the idea of invading Communist China. President Harry Truman responded firmly, stating that military authority could never outweigh political authority. He explained to the American public that the critical question was whether communist expansion could be stopped without triggering a general war. Truman emphasized that the United States and its United Nations allies believed the best chance to prevent global war was to confront communist aggression in Korea and defeat it there. However, a series of events made it clear that General MacArthur did not agree with this policy. Truman concluded that it was essential to relieve MacArthur of his command in order to remove any doubt about the true purpose and direction of American policy. With deep personal regret, Truman took this action, acknowledging MacArthur as one of the nation's greatest military leaders but insisting that the cause of world peace was more important than any single individual. In July 1951, peace talks began at Panmunjom as communist powers grew unwilling to lose face in Korea. The fundamental American objective, to halt communist aggression, had been achieved, strengthening the prospects for world peace. Nevertheless, negotiations and sporadic fighting dragged on for months as Truman's second term neared its end. Meanwhile, Republican Dwight D. Eisenhower was nominated for president on a clear and powerful promise. He declared that the new administration would begin by putting aside political distractions and focusing on ending the Korean War. Eisenhower insisted that this mission required a personal visit to Korea, believing only first-hand observation would allow him to serve the American people effectively in the cause of peace. In the 1952 election, Eisenhower decisively defeated Adlai Stevenson, bringing an end to 20 years of Democratic rule. In his farewell address, President Truman spoke candidly to the nation. He made no new political announcements and revealed no new policies, choosing instead to express gratitude and say goodbye. Truman described the immense demands of the presidency, explaining that the job required long days, often 17 hours, with no overtime pay. He signed his name hundreds of times daily, met countless people each month, and carried the responsibility of running the largest enterprise in the world. He urged Americans to understand how difficult the job truly was, not for his sake, but for the sake of his successor. As he cleared his desk and prepared to leave the White House with Mrs. Truman, he expressed no regrets. He believed they had done their best in public service and had contributed to the welfare of the nation and the peace of the world. With that, he bid the country good night and offered his blessing. Thus ended an era. Harry S. Truman brought Midwestern common sense to the White House. He was never confused by overly complex reasoning or intellectual posturing that had led others to disastrous decisions. Truman believed that without a clear destination, no wind could ever be favorable. He governed with clear, simple objectives and relied on an inner moral compass shaped by conscience, faith, and family values. Once he weighed right and wrong, he trusted his judgment and acted decisively. He was never paralyzed by indecision or consumed by worry, which he believed was merely interest paid on a debt that might never come due. Truman's deep understanding of the presidency prevented him from being immobilized by excessive caution. What historians later called his courage of decision was, to Truman, simply doing what he believed was right. As he believed, what we are is God's gift to us, and what we become is our gift in return. According to a survey of 75 prominent historians, Harry S. Truman ranks as the 9th greatest president in American history. His rise stands as a testament to democracy, which produced a simple man capable of making historic decisions during one of the world's most critical periods. From a modest, bookish background reminiscent of Tom Sawyer, Truman entered adulthood with poor eyesight and an unremarkable middle initial. Neither obstacle kept him from serving in World War I. Rising to the rank of artillery captain, he later leaped into politics, enduring financial failure along the way. He quickly adapted to the rough world of Kansas City politics and managed to survive a grimy political era with remarkably few lasting scars. He was never labeled a ward politician until he became president. The women in Truman's life played a vital role in preserving his personal values amid a world filled with conflict and noise. His daughter Margaret's musical ambitions occasionally led to awkward public moments, and his family endured the scrutiny reserved for a president's loved ones. Truman never expected to become vice president. Roosevelt selected him as a last-minute compromise. He would have been content remaining a senator, but once fate placed him in the White House, few could match his accomplishments. For generations to come, American political leaders would tip their hats in admiration to the political miracle known as Harry S. Truman.